For my project, I chose to look a little more into St. Bonaventure and his Epistemology. In Dr. Yates' lecture about Bonaventure, he discussed how Bonaventure takes elements from both Aristotelian and Augustinian philosophy and epistemology, and as a philosophy student, I've become familiar with those schools of thought. So I thought this was a good opportunity to look more into this wonderful saint of the Catholic Church, to learn more about this medieval philosopher. As philosophy students, we often look a lot at Thomas Aquinas, but I thought this was a good opportunity to dive a little more into St. Bonaventure. So let's do it. St. Bonaventure of Bagnoregio was a 14th century Franciscan. He wrote Journey of the Mind into God, or as sometimes translated, Journey of the Mind to God, and in it contains his epistemological stance. It is rich with philosophy and theology. It could be considered a devotional work, I think. It is very poetic, very prayerful, and in that way reads like the writings of St. Augustine. But it is definitely philosophical. He makes a lot of distinctions, there is a lot of categorization, and there's a lot of discussion of natural philosophy. And in that way, it reads similar to a work of Aristotle. It's remarkable that he's able to combine two seemingly differing styles. But not only that, he's able to reconcile ideas from two seemingly differing schools of thought, that of Aristotle and Plato. Now, there are ways in which Aristotle's and Plato's philosophies are not differing or contrary. Aquinas is considered an Aristotelian, but there are definitely ways in which he uses Plato's ideas and Augustine's ideas as well. With my presentation, I hope to elucidate Bonaventure's epistemology and show where he has been influenced by both Augustine and Aristotle. I'm using Augustine, using his name as kind of a head and representative of the Platonic position, because I think Bonaventure's Platonic ideas mostly come through Augustine. Augustine being a Neoplatonist, and Augustine is able to Christianize a lot of Plato's ideas. I think it's clear as Christians we ought to hold some of Augustine's ideas, particularly that of the place that grace and divine illumination have in our epistemology and in our coming to knowledge of things. It's clear that we need grace, that our intellects have been darkened, and we often consider knowledge as a supernatural gift, as a gift of the Spirit. There's also a way in which there are truths, and even the greatest truths, that are above us, that are supernatural, that we need aid. We need God to illuminate us, to reveal himself to us. But Augustine provides kind of how that happens, or how we can ascend to God. And of course, that's the way that Bonaventure presents it as well, the work of, or the title of his work being Journey of the Mind into God. But Bonaventure is also curious about how we can come to know things naturally. There's a way in which people without faith, they still have the senses. So how can we come to know the sensible world with our senses? Well, Bonaventure borrows Aristotle's epistemology because it provides a system and a language with which we can organize the sensible world. But not only that, Bonaventure seems to hold an Aristotelian position insofar as how we encounter the sensible world. Both Aristotle and Bonaventure hold that when we encounter a physical thing, it does exist, but there's a way in which it comes to existence in our intellect. And so I will say more about that later. I should mention, though, that for Bonaventure, there is always a place for the supernatural, that underlying even natural philosophy is the divine. But he's able to borrow what's useful and what's truthful from both of these schools of thought. So let's dive into that. The most fundamental idea that Bonaventure holds is that divine illumination is absolutely necessary. And the way to be illumined, to have the intellect illumined by God, is through prayer. And he says it's very straightforward in his explanation of it. We have to ask. We have to ask the Lord to help us. And the prayer that he writes out is very beautiful. It's one sentence. It's, "Lead me forth, Lord, in thy way, and let me step in thy truth. Let my heart be glad that it fears thy name." So this prayer is really the first step to even beginning to engage in coming to knowledge in the epistemological pursuit. So once we've engaged, there's a kind of progress. And so he breaks out into three main parts. We're illumined in that we are able to see the world of matter, of physical things, for what it is. But we'll also see later that by seeing things in the physical world, we can come to know God. So it's interesting. We need God to understand the sensible world in a meaningful way, but we also engage with the sensible world to come to know God in a greater way. Next, we can be illumined by understanding spiritual things. So understanding here is he's meaning things that maybe lie deeper than just the physical world, the things that are invisible. And the next is illumination of eternal art, of God himself. And so we, in this progress, we have kind of three principal powers of sight that correspond to this threefold progress. So there's our animal or sensory sight, in which we can see exterior corporals. But then there's also this sight of the spirit that he says it's kind of an introspective thing. You look within the self, in the self, and through that, through kind of engaging with your soul and also finding spiritual realities, we can also come to greater knowledge of ourself and of God. And then this last power of sight is the mind. It can see things that are above the self, and that's the thing that can behold God for what he is. Something that he points out, which is very beautiful, is that Christ can walk with us in each of these things, in each of these ways of illumination in this progress. So Christ is with us, but he's also our stairway. He's through which we walk through these phases, you could say, this progress. And that's because Christ is and has perfect knowledge of each of these things. He has perfect sight of corporal, for he is a physical being himself now, right? He became man. And, of course, he is also spiritual and even divine. And when talking about Christ, Bonaventure says a very important epistemological statement, because the epistemological endeavor is to see if we can know things and how we can know things. But he says that Christ has thoroughly taught the knowledge of the truth. So he's necessary. And he's done it, he's taught us through what he calls the threefold manner of theology. The symbolic, Jesus used these symbols and these parables, right? And we're able to rightly use and understand the sensible. And then the next one he calls the proper, through which we can rightly use the intelligible. And lastly, this beautiful statement about Christ teaching us the mystical, so that we can be wrapped to super mental excesses. Bonaventure compares the way that we see the sensible world to looking into a mirror. Like a mirror, when we look into the world, we see a reflection of things. We see an image. And he calls these images God's vestiges. And we come to see God and come to know God through his vestiges. But that is only the beginning of the ascent to God. It starts where we are. It starts in the physical world. But he says that there are 6 steps of ascension into God. From the depths to the heights, from exterior things towards things interior, from temporality towards eternity. So I provide these 6 steps, but for our purposes here, we're going to really dive into the first one. As the ascent goes on, and as you dive deeper into his work, it gets more and more mystical and theological. But primarily I want to focus on how we encounter things in the sensible world, and how we can come to know what they are as they are, but also how we can know God through his vestiges. So I've already mentioned a kind of overarching threefold sight, that of the animal or sensory sight, the spiritual sight, and the sight of the mind. Well, he further breaks it down inside of the kind of animal or sensory sight. There is another layer, a threefold sight that exists within that. And so the sensory sight, he means, what he's referring to is the 5 senses. So using our 5 senses and engaging with the world, he mentions this, what he calls threefold sight, or the 3 ways in which we can engage with the world. So this first sight is contemplation. He says sight of the one contemplating, and this isn't like prayer contemplation. He talks about that later. This is specifically referring to the contemplation of physical things, and this is an intellectual manner. And here it's very Aristotelian. It's the considering of things in themselves, in their essences. So some of the ways that he breaks them down, I don't want to get too bogged down by, but he says the weight in regard to their position, where they're inclining. He says that the number here, what he's referring to, is the way in which they're distinguished from one another. And in the measure, he's referring to the way in which things are limited. And so I think here he means by form, that matter, this pure potency, has this kind of, it's limited by form and kind of contained to be one thing. And then within all of these things are these very Aristotelian distinctions of their species, their place in the overarching order, what their substance is, what their virtue is, what their activity is by virtue of what their substance is. So for Bonaventure, there is a place for contemplating in considering the actual existence of things in a natural manner, but also remember, as we've said, divine illumination helps us in understanding the material world. So we're even aided in this intellectual manner of the one contemplating. Now the next is more theological, but this is still concerning sensible things. It's looking at them in a faithful manner, and what he means by that is considering them in light of their origin, which is God. And so we can learn about what they are because of who they've come from, and from that sight we can learn more about their purpose, their end. And so it is primarily with this kind of sight that we invite God in to help us see things as they are in God's, he says, three laws, in their nature, but also teaching us what things are through the laws of Scripture and the laws of grace. And the third of this threefold sight is the sight of investigation, the sight of the one investigating, and he considers the world in a rational manner. And here is a lot of categorization. So Bonaventure categorizes the things that are between the things that only are, the things that are and live, right? Okay, so we're making the distinction between inanimate things and animate things, and finally things that are, live, and discern. So he's kind of classifying things by their activity, if you can consider being as an activity, because an inanimate thing is, but it is not living. But then the living things, they are being, and they are also living. But then what humans can do is be. They can live, and they can also discern. But then he also kind of breaks down the things that are only corporal, things that are partly corporal, partly spiritual. Again, so this is the language that he uses. I think he's referring to humans. I mean, they're partly corporal, partly spiritual, just meaning that there are ways in which each of these are true. There is a corporal nature and a spiritual nature as well. Not that we're like half body, half soul. That's not what he's saying. And then finally the things that are only spiritual, the angels and God himself. And then amidst the things that are only spiritual, he kind of breaks up into things that are mutable and incorruptible. So I think this is the created things that are only spiritual, so the angels. And then finally what he calls the super celestial, the things that are immutable and incorruptible. So now the purpose that he has of breaking these down is he's showing us the various ways in which we encounter the world and can see it. And his argument is that through this threefold sight, if we look at the world with the side of contemplation, considering things in themselves, if we look at the world with the side of one believing, considering things in their origin, and we are also considering things in this kind of investigative, rational manner, then what we will come to is seeing God in things, invisible things, and that they rise up together and teach us something about, specifically, he says, the power, wisdom, and goodness of God. And when we look at the world with this threefold sight, we can see kind of the conditions by which things are. And he breaks that into 7, the septiform conditions of visible creatures. And with each of these, he connects it to how they reveal God's power, wisdom, and goodness, like I mentioned on the last slide. So, for example, when we consider things in their origin, we can kind of look into God's power. It reveals God's power to us to see that they were created from nothing. So we can behold God's power in His ability to do that, something that's unthinkable and something that we can't even quite comprehend. And it reveals His wisdom because in their origin things were distinguished lucidly, right? He made the variety of animals, and no two look alike. We can tell the difference between even the plants, right? I mean, in this picture you can see the different species of flower, and I think of this too. I get the image of how no two persons look the same. And finally, what he says about the way that considering things in their origin reveals God's goodness is because they are adorned with largesse. And of course, we know this by experience, just from seeing creation and admiring its beauty. The next condition is the magnitude by which we see, or that we see magnitude in things because of their length, breadth, and depth, like a big mountain or the depths of the ocean. But here he's not just talking about physical size, but also according to their virtue and according to their efficacy. So these also reveal God's power, wisdom, and goodness. And the next condition he discusses that we see in things is their great multitude and the great diversity of substance, he says. But also, in this diversity of substances, let's say maybe in the diversity, in the distinction between plants, animals, and humans, but then even in the animal kingdom, the diversity that exists within that. But then he even breaks it down further into what he calls beauty. And I call this diversity of accidents because what he's referring to is kind of the many colors and lights and figures, he says, that the world provides for us, even in one type of substance, like dogs. We see many different colors, and even if we consider a flower to be a substance, we can see here that because of their colors, they provide for us a kind of beauty. Next, he discusses the fullness of things, and he says this interesting statement, very Aristotelian, that matter is full of forms. So here I think he's talking about matter as pure potency, that all matter that could be is actually contained, or you could say limited, but also that there is a form provided for all matter. There is no pure potency. There is no pure matter in that sense, because all matter corresponds or has a form. And then the form is the thing that lets matter kind of be distinguishable from other things, and so then they act by virtue of what they are, by virtue of their form. So their form is full of virtue, and then the virtue, these acts that things do because of their form, now has effects, right? And they work together in the world. And so, I mean, I think these next two, activity and order, is kind of an extension of this discussion of fullness, because of the manifold activity of things that we can see and consider, and that comes from their fullness. And then likewise, order. The world is ordered in such an amazing, remarkable way, and that everything, matter that's full of forms that are full of virtue full of effects, all of the effects line up and kind of strike a balance and create or make up the world that we know. And so in this discussion, when we look at things with the threefold sight, and from that can see the septiform conditions of visible creatures, he believes that reveals God. And like I said, I mean, God has to be part of the equation when you are looking at these things. But he thinks that it's just so obvious, right? And he begins with that prayer. But in this kind of consideration of visible things, he says the statement, and that's what this therefore is corresponding to, and so I'll read it. Therefore, he who is not brightened by such splendors of created things is blind. He who does not awake at such clamors is deaf. He who does not praise God on account of all these effects is mute. He who does not turn towards the first principle on account of such indications is stupid. Wow. What a great statement. Bonaventure keeps digging. He wants to know how we can come to these realizations just with our senses. How we can come to know God, to contemplate Him, His essence, His power, His presence in things. So first he sees that the way that we need to look at it is that the things actually enter our minds when we sense something. So there's a way in which there's an existence of the thing as considered by us. That it resides in the intellect, because there's a real kind of world of our soul. So there's the world, which is a macrocosm, but our soul is in itself a kind of world, a microcosm. So the world enters our soul. So the first step is that we apprehend something. The apprehensive power is a thing that allows something to first enter our mind through any one or all up to all five of the senses. So this is like we get an impression of something, we're holding it in maybe our mind's eye, and then from this comes enjoyment, right? And of course, when he's talking about the septiform conditions of things, including their beauty, we encounter these things right when we apprehend them, right when we get this first impression of them. Next, we subject the thing to scrutiny, and we begin to make judgments, what he calls dejudication. So it resides in the intellective power, and we make it subject to our intellective power. We subject it to abstraction. We try to make sense of it. We break it down into the things that it is. And of course, this is very Aristotelian. So we can actually come to real knowledge of things by allowing it to reside in our mind and kind of breaking down. At least we can come to know about things through this process. And I think another thing that kind of keeps him from skepticism and really believing that we can do this and that things aren't just all illusory is this fundamental trust that he has for God, that God is revealing himself in the world, and so he's not trying to fool us with things, and so that we can have this this endeavor to see the world and to believe that fundamentally it's real, and that we can perceive things and subject it to this intellective power in this process of abstraction. But the end is not ever the self. The goal is not just necessarily to come to knowledge of things, and that's not really what Bonaventure is concerned with. He's concerned with how these vestiges, how these things in the sensible world can lead us to God, to gaze on eternal truth. And what he says is that it's through this power of dejudication that we can really break things down and begin to see God in what they are, right? And this kind of calls back to the septiform condition of things. They reveal God's power, wisdom, and goodness. I think this point of dejudication is really where the kind of Augustinian and Aristotelian ideas come together. I've provided this very famous image of Aristotle gesturing to the earth and Plato gesturing to the heavens. But it seems to me that for Bonaventure, there's an element of both. That there is a real existence and a real understanding that we can have of things in the sensible world. But ultimately, I think the pointing upwards is the thing that kind of rules out. It wins out, I should say. But there is definitely an aspect of both, and he definitely includes Aristotle's philosophy about how we engage with the world to even enhance his own idea of divine illumination and how we can come to know God through the sensible world.